I'm a keeper at a cemetery in the mountains. There are strange rules to follow. The Blackthorn Hills are steeped in myths and folklore, stories whispered through generations. From the eerie shimmer of ghostly lights to the unsettling murmurs of lost souls roaming the mist-draped valleys, the hills have long been home to disturbing tales. Yet, some accounts, those too dreadful for the townsfolk to utter, remain buried deep within the land, concealed from all but the most daring individuals. Eli Mercer, a 33-year-old caretaker at Hollow Creek Cemetery in remote Tennessee, had heard countless rumors about the graveyard. Perched atop a lonely hill, the cemetery overlooked the vast and silent stretch of the hills. Few visitors arrived, and fewer still left unscathed in mind. It was said the deceased here were restless, their spirits never finding peace, constantly reaching from beneath the earth. But solitude was something Eli had grown accustomed to as he maintained the aging tombstones and the skeletal remains below. Unbeknownst to him, his latest assignment would unearth something far more sinister than mere relics of forgotten lives. With his boots grinding against the gravel path leading to the oldest section of the cemetery, Eli hesitated at the threshold. His shovel rested on his shoulder, while a leather tool pouch swung lightly at his hip. The wind whispered through the trees, carrying the faint scent of decay. The damp ground clung to his footsteps, and the cold seeped into his very bones. The graveyard had always been eerily quiet, some would say unnaturally so, but today, something was different. His supervisor, Silas Cobb, a grizzled and no-nonsense man, had assigned him an unusual task, exhuming a set of skeletal hands that had been interred for years. The hands supposedly belonged to a man who had perished in a grisly accident long ago, and yet, they had remained unchanged beneath the soil. "They've been in the ground long enough," Silas had said, his tone grim. "You need to lay them to rest in the Mercer burial ground, over by the eastern corner." Eli began to dig, surprised by how soft the earth was, as if someone had disturbed it recently. Several times, he paused, glancing over his shoulder, a persistent feeling of being watched gnawing at him. Though he had never put much stock in superstitions, the legends surrounding the cemetery spoke of the dead clawing their way back to the surface. At last, his shovel struck something: delicate, yellowed bones. They appeared unnaturally well preserved, more so than he had expected. His hands trembled as he carefully placed them in a wooden box, but something unusual caught his eye. As he wiped his hands and prepared to relocate the remains, he noticed markings, rules, engraved onto the nearby headstone. Eli wiped a sheen of sweat from his forehead despite the biting chill in the air. The old tombstone was cracked and weathered, but as he examined it closely, faint carvings began to emerge. Initially, he assumed it was merely the passage of time wearing the stone down, but upon further inspection, he realized the marks were deliberate, etched with intent. Someone, or something, had inscribed them for a reason. The first rule read, "Do not tamper with the hands. They must remain buried." More unsettling was the second rule: if you remove the hands from their resting place, you must follow the next instructions precisely, or the earth will claim you. Eli's heartbeat quickened. His eyes darted across the rest of the inscription. Another rule slowly became visible, as if surfacing from the grave itself. Bury them at the Mercer burial ground beneath the full moon. Keep facing forward. Do not look back. His fingers trembled as he traced the engravings. Though some words seemed disjointed, the overall pattern was clear. The hands that dig seek release. Do not break the circle. If the earth calls to you, return them at once. Only when the digging hands are at rest will peace be restored. Eli exhaled sharply. Though he had heard of strange occurrences in these hills, disappearances, sudden deaths, stories of wandering spirits, this felt different. The strict nature of the rules left little room for doubt. His hands shook as he carefully enclosed the skeletal remains in the wooden box, an inexplicable weight settling over him. A sudden gust of wind sent dry leaves swirling at his feet as he gathered his tools. Then, a noise, a faint scraping, rose from beneath him. At first, he dismissed it as the wind rustling through the trees, but the sound persisted, growing stronger, more insistent, as though something beneath the earth was stirring. The hairs on the back of his neck bristled. Gripping the box tightly, he turned swiftly, his mind racing. Should he adhere to the instructions? Dare he defy them? Or was this merely an elaborate superstition? The ground trembled beneath him, an eerie resonance urging him toward a decision. Eli stumbled back, his heartbeat hammering in his chest. The scraping turned to clawing, desperate and unrelenting. This was no trick of the wind. Something that did not belong in this world, was fighting to break free. With fingers clutching the edges of the wooden box, his breath caught in his throat. His gaze dropped to the skeletal hands wrapped beneath the cloth inside. Smooth, unnervingly cold, they felt far too real. And then, beneath his feet, the earth groaned, shifting ever so slightly, as though it was waking up. He had to complete his task. It was what Silas Cobb had assigned him and what he was paid to do. Yet, that persistent scraping sound refused to cease. Things were escalating, almost as though the hands in the box were reacting, urging him to hurry. Eli Mercer steadied his nerves and started toward the family plot in the eastern corner of the cemetery, where he was to rebury the hands. The relentless, dreadful scratching followed him. Glancing back, he saw nothing but the long shadows cast by the worn gravestones. The earth felt strangely soft beneath his feet when he reached the Mercer burial ground, as if it had been anticipating something. Focusing on his duty, he tried to ignore the eerie sensation crawling up his spine. The moon was rising, casting a silvery glow over the graveyard, making the stones appear ghostly. The weight of the rules pressed heavily upon him. "Do not turn around." The words from the gravestone echoed in his mind. Knowing he had already broken one of the rules by removing the hands, he swallowed hard. He could not stop now. He had to finish before something worse happened. The hands were out. Eli knelt, ready to bury them. With trembling fingers, he dug a small hole and gently placed the wooden box inside. As soon as he covered it with earth, the scratching stopped. Yet, beneath him, the ground felt strangely alive, shifting. He wiped his brow, trying to shake the unease. His heart pounded, but he felt a fleeting sense of relief. Maybe, he thought, it was over. He believed, followed the rules. Then it happened. A deep, guttural growl rumbled from beneath him. Eli's blood ran cold as the earth around the grave trembled. The soil shifted as if unseen fingers clawed toward the surface. The hands were trying to escape. The growling grew louder, and the scratching resumed, more desperate than before. Eli stumbled back, his mind racing. He had done what was required, hadn't he? Why wasn't it working? Why wasn't it stopping? His eyes darted to the tombstone. The inscription had changed. The words were no longer the ones he had read before. New rules had appeared, urgent, dire. The hands are unsettled. They will not rest until they are returned to their rightful place. Eli read the fresh carvings, his stomach twisting in fear. His gaze roamed over the new inscriptions, each word sending a wave of dread through him. The hands are restless. The phrase repeated in his head, the suffering of the dead growing louder, the earth beneath him pulsing with the consequences of his actions. His gaze flickered across the graveyard. The trees, tall and ominous, seemed to lean closer, their branches like gnarled fingers reaching for him. The wind howled through the cemetery, carrying whispers. But his focus remained fixed on the ground, on the restless, living earth. The scratching intensified. It was no longer just a distant noise, it was deliberate, purposeful, dragging across the soil with intent. Eli's pulse quickened. The hands, were they still unsettled? Were they? He couldn't stay. He had to set things right. His mind scrambled, trying to recall the rules he had read. There had to be something he had missed. Had he truly followed them all? He buried the hands beneath the full moon, turned away, and respected the cemetery's conditions. Yet, here he stood, as though the very ground defied him. He turned to leave, but the sound came again. Closer now, more urgent, like nails scraping a chalkboard, slicing through his thoughts. The scratching emanated from the graves. He hesitated. Was it the hands, as the rules had warned? Had they already begun clawing their way free? Or was it something else, something darker, older, more sinister? Eli's mind whirled. He had to return to the grave, retrieve the hands, and do what he should have done in the first place, follow the rules without hesitation. But the mere thought of touching them again made his skin crawl. If he delayed, what would happen? Then a sound pierced the night, a quiet wail, not belonging to any living thing. Eli froze. It came from the direction of the Mercer burial ground. It was the hands, reaching for him from beneath the soil. They were calling. There was no other explanation, no rational reason for the eerie sounds filling the cemetery that day. He had no choice. Whirling around, he dashed back toward the grave. By the time he arrived, the ground beneath him rippled, shifting as though something beneath was stirring. A cold wave of fear swept over Eli Mercer, his breath caught in his throat as he dropped to his knees and gripped his shovel. The warnings had been clear. The instructions had been straightforward. If the hands were disturbed or removed from their rightful place and not returned, the earth would take him. As he frantically clawed at the soil, he could feel a rhythmic pulse beneath his fingertips, almost like a heartbeat. Something was guiding him, compelling him to dig deeper, faster. The wind had stilled. The only sound was the awful scraping, the frantic scratching of skeletal fingers beneath the surface. Eli's shovel struck something firm. With trembling hands and a pounding heart, he pulled it free from the dirt, his breaths coming in ragged gasps. He flipped open the box, only to find it empty. The hands were gone. The bones had vanished. Worse still, the scratching had stopped. But the silence was far more terrifying. The tomb before him stood gaping and vacant. The grave had been unearthed from below. Rising from the darkness was a gaunt figure with hollow eyes and an emaciated face, its skeletal hands stretching toward him. Eli finally understood the horrific truth. The hands had not been properly buried. They had returned for him. His chest tightened as the figure crawled from the tomb, its presence an embodiment of dread. Paralyzed by fear, he stumbled backward. The thing was gaunt, its form draped in tattered remnants of decay, its skeletal fingers reaching out hungrily. Its movements were unnatural, disturbingly smooth, as though it had been waiting for his failure. The air around him thickened, suffocating, charged with the cemetery's ancient secrets. The ground beneath him groaned with a sound neither natural nor human. Again, the figure extended its bony fingers, locking its hollow gaze with his, as though pulling at the core of his soul. He staggered backward, his mind screaming the warnings over and over. You must bury them. He had broken the rules, and now he faced the consequences. With shaking hands, Eli gripped his shovel and turned from the grave. His muscles seized. His legs wavered as though unseen forces restrained him, keeping him from fleeing. The figure dragged itself closer, its clawed fingers scraping against the dirt. The scraping noise he had first heard had now morphed into a guttural growl, reverberating through the cemetery like an otherworldly chant. Panic gripped him. What could he do? His wild eyes darted across the rows of tombstones. He had to follow the rules, had to fix this, but how? The ground itself pulsed with malevolent energy. He had already disturbed the hands. Was it too late? Then, as if led by instinct, his gaze locked onto the nearest gravestone, an unmarked slab, cracked and weathered with age. Acting on impulse, he lunged toward it and began digging, heedless of the pain as his nails clawed at the stone. He was frantic, desperate. Behind him, the creature never averted its lifeless stare. Eli dug feverishly when suddenly the earth exhaled a low, haunting sigh. The soil itself seemed alive, pressing in on him as though resisting his efforts. The pressure on his chest tightened, making each breath harder to take. The growling and scratching intensified, closing in around him. Then, something impossible happened. The earth split before him, revealing a battered, hidden box buried deep within the ground. Unlike the first, this one was smaller, yet it carried an eerie significance. Without hesitation, Eli yanked it free and pried it open. Inside, another set of skeletal hands rested, eerily pristine as if untouched by time. You have disturbed the hands. The warning etched into the bones read, clearer than before, you must bury them again. Only then will the ground be silent. Eli's pulse thundered. He had found them. These were the hands. There was no escaping the graveyard's curse. He had no choice but to follow the rules. He had to return them to the soil. But when he turned, the figure was gone. It had vanished into the abyss, as though it had never existed. Yet, the scratching remained. It still came from the tomb. Eli grasped the skeletal hands tightly, his fingers trembling. The rules seemed to radiate a dreadful energy through the fragile bones. Time was running out. Though the grave was now silent, the fear he felt was something else entirely. His thoughts raced with doubt and panic. Was reburial truly the answer? Had he only roused something far more sinister? Would this truly put an end to the nightmare? Though the rumbling beneath the earth had faded into a distant vibration, it brought him no relief. The graveyard felt different, charged, pulsing with an ominous energy. The air weighed heavy, as if the entire cemetery was waiting for him to make a mistake. Eli Mercer scanned his surroundings, his breath uneven, his eyes darting wildly from one darkened corner to another. His pulse spiked at every gust of wind rustling the trees, every shifting shadow cast by the moonlight. Still, the scraping sound persisted, faint but ever present, like nails dragging over stone. It was further away now. Maybe he had made it in time. Maybe he could still fix everything. His knees buckled as he stepped forward to dig, sending him crashing to the ground. His head struck the dirt, and for a moment, the world tilted. The soil was damp and chilled, yet beneath its surface, he felt something unnatural, a strange, radiating warmth pulsing like a heartbeat. The night had fallen eerily still. Not a peaceful silence, but one thick and suffocating, as though the earth itself was holding its breath. Eli's gaze swept across the cemetery as his mind struggled to process everything he had witnessed. Had the hands been calling to him? Had it all been in his mind, or had he truly heard those whispers and growls? His pulse pounded as he pushed himself upright, gripping the wooden box tightly. He had to act before something far worse took place. He had to bury them. With the shovel in his grasp, he knelt by the grave, the moonlight casting eerie shadows across the tombstones. Just as the rules had warned, the full moon hung directly overhead, pressing him toward the task at hand. He could feel the ground tugging at him. The warnings, the guidelines, everything had led to this moment. Time was slipping away. If he didn't bury the hands now, would the earth claim him too? He dug frantically, carving a deep hole before dropping the skeletal hands inside with a final, desperate motion. His movements were frantic, erratic as he shoveled dirt over them. The growls, the scratching, the restless stirrings of the cemetery surrounded him. The cold, unyielding soil swallowed the hands whole. But something was wrong. Friends, if you like the content I create, please subscribe. It helps the channel to grow a lot. Eli's breath hitched. The noises hadn't stopped. The low growls still rumbled beneath his feet, and the clawing persisted. Staggering backward, his body trembled. His legs threatened to give out. The sounds were growing louder, sharper. The very ground seemed to be speaking to him, alive, enraged. He could feel it, the weight of the earth, the grip of the grave. It was too late. He turned to run. Something latched onto his ankle, a skeletal hand, icy and rigid, dragging him down. Eli's heart pounded in his chest. The fingers clenched tighter, unrelenting, as though the earth itself had awakened and sought retribution for his intrusion. Desperate, he fought, kicking and twisting to break free. His screams filled the night, but they were futile. Inch by inch, the unseen force reeled him back toward the grave. The soil clung to him, its chilling grip climbing higher, searing his skin with an unnatural cold. His hands clawed desperately at the dirt, fingers sinking into the soil, but the harder he struggled, the stronger the pull became. His breaths came in sharp, panicked gasps as the growls and scraping noises swelled into a deafening chorus of unseen hands clawing their way up from the abyss. His mind spiraled. The rules had been crystal clear. He had disturbed the hands, and now he was paying the price. But nowhere in the guidelines had it mentioned this. This wasn't part of the plan. He had followed the instructions, every single one. So why wasn't it working? Why wasn't it stopping? The very earth beneath him pulsed with a dreadful rhythm, as if it were alive, and the grave continued to pull him downward. Were the digging hands the same wretched ones that had clawed their way free? Though nothing had prepared him for this, the warnings had spoken of the consequences. He froze as an icy breath ghosted over his skin. His eyes widened as he realized something loomed just above him. But it was not the figure he had seen before. No, this was something different, something ancient, something far older. The stench of decay thickened in the air, and from the darkness of the tomb, a hollow voice rasped, "You disturbed them. Now, they will disturb you." The earth rumbled in agreement, a chorus of whispering voices rising from the ground. Eli Mercer's head spun, but the skeletal grip around his ankle tightened, dragging him deeper. His body was now halfway buried, the weight of the soil pressing against his chest. The only sounds left were the relentless scratching, the reaching, the claiming hands. Then, the dead thing returned, but it was no longer alone. More skeletal hands burst through the ground, clawing their way up from the surrounding graves. Horror seized Eli as realization dawned. They weren't just reaching for him. His breath came in shallow gasps as he understood. They were pulling him into the earth, calling him to join them. The ground stretched wide like a gaping maw, and the cemetery itself seemed to be swallowing him whole. His fingers, trembling, clawed at the dirt in desperation, but there was no escape. He was surrounded, the relentless grasp of the dead closing in. Eli's last thought, as the ground finally consumed him, was one of chilling clarity. There were no more rules. There was only the grave. Hollow Creek Cemetery returned to silence. The weathered tombstones remained undisturbed, their long-buried secrets hidden beneath layers of time. The Mercer burial ground, where Eli had desperately tried to lay the hands to rest, was now just another forgotten corner of the cemetery, its tombstone cracked and worn. The whispers that had once haunted the night had faded into nothing, and the earth had stilled once more. But if you listen closely on a quiet night, you may hear something beneath the soil, scraping, clawing, restless. And if you dare step too close to the graves, you might feel the cold grasp of something unseen beneath your feet. The hands are waiting. Do you think it was possible to stop the curse, or was Eli doomed from the beginning? Write your opinion in the comments. Be sure to subscribe and like. I dream of 1,000 subscribers, and I'm sure we can reach this goal together.